They had been inside the Stanley Hotel for less than 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That's all it took. The lead investigator, a guy named Marcus Webb, who had been doing this for over 12 years, 12 years of abandoned hospitals, crumbling asylums, forgotten Civil War battlefields, this man who had seen everything, was standing completely still in the hallway of the 4th floor, his thermal camera slowly falling from his hands, because on the screen, something was walking toward him. Not a shadow, not a glitch, a full, solid, human-shaped mass of cold energy, moving down that hallway with purpose. And when it stopped directly in front of him, 3 feet away, close enough to touch. And Marcus Webb, 12 years, hundreds of investigations, started crying. Not from fear. He said later it wasn't fear at all. He said it felt like grief. Like whatever was standing in front of him had been waiting a very, very long time. The Stanley Hotel sits at the edge of Estes Park, Colorado, tucked against the Rocky Mountains like something out of a fever dream. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Stephen King stayed here in 1974, checked into room 217, had a nightmare so vivid and so disturbing that he woke up in a cold sweat and immediately started writing The Shining. The hotel became the real-world blueprint for the Overlook, and to this day, guests report hearing children laughing in empty hallways, pianos playing by themselves in the ballroom, and heavy suitcases being unpacked in rooms where no one is staying. So when the Southwest Paranormal Collective, a 5-person investigative team based out of Denver, got access to the Stanley for a full overnight lock-in in October, they knew they were walking into something big. What they didn't know was just how personal the night was about to get. The team was made up of Marcus Webb, the lead investigator and equipment specialist, Diane Rosario, a former EMT turned EVP researcher, brothers Cal and Pete and Wynn, who handled cameras and environmental readings, and their newest member, a woman named Tessa Greer, who was only on her 3rd investigation and still learning the ropes. They set up base camp in the lobby around 9 p.m. Equipment spread across the floor, spirit boxes, full-spectrum cameras, EMF detectors, a custom-built thermal imaging rig that Marcus had spent 3 years modifying. By 9:30, they were ready. By 9:45, the first thing happened. Cal was running a baseline EMF sweep on the 2nd floor when his detector spiked. Not a gradual climb, but an instant, violent jump from 0.2 milligauss all the way to 14.7. He called out to his brother, and Pete came over with the camera rolling. The spike lasted 11 seconds, then dropped back to baseline. No electrical sources nearby, no wiring in the walls at that section of the hallway. Nothing that should have caused it. They noted it, marked the location, and moved on. The 2nd floor of the Stanley is where most of the residual activity is reported. Leftover energy, psychic impressions burned into the walls from decades of human emotion. But the active intelligence, the stuff that responds, that communicates, that tends to cluster on the 4th floor, specifically in and around room 428. Room 428 is where a former caretaker named Elizabeth Wilson is said to have died back in the early 1900s. Unlike the more famous room 217, where a housekeeper was injured in a gas explosion, room 428 carries a darker story, one that the hotel staff doesn't advertise. Elizabeth, by most historical accounts, was devoted to the hotel almost to the point of obsession. She never married, never left Estes Park. She poured her entire life into the Stanley, caring for it like it was her own home, her own child. And when she died, alone, in that room, in the middle of winter, she apparently never left either. Guests in room 428 have reported waking up to find a woman standing at the foot of the bed, just watching them. Not threatening, not violent, just watching, with an expression that one guest described as unbearably sad. Housekeeping staff refused to enter the room alone. One maintenance worker quit outright after saying he felt a hand on his shoulder when no one else was in the room. Marcus knew all of this when he led the team to the 4th floor around 11 p.m. The hallway up there was different from the rest of the hotel, quieter. Even the ambient sounds of the building, the settling of old wood, the distant hum of climate control, seemed to fade out. Tessa mentioned it first, saying it felt like walking into a room after someone had just been crying. That specific kind of loaded silence. Nobody disagreed. They set up a static camera at the end of the hallway, aimed at room 428's door, and Marcus started a slow walk down the corridor with the thermal rig. That's when the incident from the hook happened, when the thermal camera picked up the cold mass moving toward him. But let me fill in what the camera didn't capture. Marcus stopped walking the moment he saw it on the screen. He held his position, kept the camera steady, and in a calm, low voice, he said, "We're not here to disturb you. We just want to understand." The mass on the thermal screen shifted slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting, like someone turning their head. Then Diane, who was standing about 20 feet behind Marcus with the audio equipment, whispered, "Marcus, the spirit box." She had turned on the spirit box, a device that rapidly scans radio frequencies, creating white noise through which many investigators believe spirits can form words. And in the static, beneath the hiss and blur of broken frequencies, something was coming through. A voice, female, measured and clear. "Still here." That was it. 2 words. "Still here." Marcus asked, "Are you Elizabeth?" The spirit box answered, "My hotel." Not yes, not her name. My hotel. Like the question of her identity was less important than the claim she was making. This place belonged to her. It still did. The thermal mass on Marcus's screen held its position for another 40 seconds. Then, slowly, it drifted back toward room 428. The temperature in the hallway climbed back up 5 degrees in under a minute, from 58 degrees Fahrenheit to 63 degrees Fahrenheit, as if whatever had been standing there had carried the cold with it. Cal checked the static camera footage later. The hallway looked completely empty. No visible figure, no shadow, nothing the naked eye could see. Only the thermal rig captured it. But what happened next? That the cameras captured just fine. It was around 1 a.m. Tessa had been sitting quietly in a chair they'd placed near room 428's door, running a solo EVP session while the others took a break downstairs to review footage. She'd been doing this for about 20 minutes, asking questions quietly into a digital recorder, when the door to room 428 opened. Not drifted, not creaked. Opened. A full, deliberate swing inward, like someone inside the room had turned the handle and pulled it toward them. Tessa's camera captured her face in real time, the way her body went rigid, the way her hand tightened on the recorder. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, to her immense credit, she stood up, took one step toward the open door, and said quietly, "Elizabeth, is that you?" From inside the dark room, the static camera they'd placed in the corner of room 428 caught something extraordinary. A shape near the window. Not moving, not reacting, just standing, side on to the camera, looking out at the mountains. The shape was present for 9 seconds. Then it was gone. When the team reviewed the footage together at 2 a.m., nobody said anything for a long time. Finally, Pete broke the silence. "She wasn't trying to scare us," he said. Marcus nodded slowly. "No, I don't think she was." Diane pulled up the audio from the spirit box session and played the 2 words again. "Still here." after 100 years. After every guest, every renovation, every Halloween tour group tramping through her hallways, Elizabeth Wilson was still in the Stanley Hotel, still keeping watch over the place that had been her whole world. Maybe that's not haunting. Maybe that's just love, the kind that doesn't know how to let go. The Southwest Paranormal Collective submitted their footage to 3 independent analysts. All 3 confirmed the thermal anomaly was not a camera malfunction, not reflected heat, and not a human being they'd missed in their head count. The EVP audio was authenticated as non-contaminated. The room 428 door footage showed no mechanical reason for the door to open. Marcus Webb still lists the Stanley investigation as the most significant experience of his 12-year career. And Tessa Greer? She's been doing paranormal investigations full-time ever since. Some encounters don't scare you away from this work. Some encounters remind you exactly why you started. There is a rule in paranormal investigation that every serious researcher knows, and almost every serious researcher will tell you they learned the hard way. You do not provoke. You don't taunt. You don't challenge. You don't throw out lines like, "Show yourself," or "If you're real, do something." Because sometimes something does. And once it does, it doesn't stop just because you asked it to. Investigator Renee Coldwell learned this rule at the Sallie House in Atchison, Kansas. She had been warned. Her team had been warned. The family that fled that house after 6 months of escalating terror had documented what happens when you push back against whatever lives in those walls. Renee went in anyway. She was inside for 4 hours. She came out with 3 unexplained scratch marks across her left forearm, deep, parallel lines that had not been there when she went in, and a recording on her audio device that her team's sound analyst refused to listen to a second time. He said it wasn't a voice. He said it was something pretending to be a voice. And the difference, he told Renee, was something he couldn't explain, only feel. The Sallie House sits on the north end of Atchison, Kansas, a small, quiet town perched above the Missouri River that has the peculiar distinction of being considered one of the most haunted cities in the entire United States. Atchison carries its ghost stories the way some towns carry their history, which in this case is really the same thing. But even in a town full of haunted houses, the Sallie House stands apart. It doesn't just have a reputation, it has a record. A documented, photographed, video-captured, physically evidenced record of something that goes beyond residual energy or benign spirits. Something that interacts. Something that retaliates. The house gained national attention in the early 1990s when a young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved in and began experiencing what started as curious anomalies and rapidly escalated into something deeply disturbing. Toys in the baby's room would rearrange themselves overnight. The temperature in certain rooms would plunge without explanation. Tony, specifically, became a target, waking up with scratches on his body, feeling invisible hands pushing him, experiencing what he described as a focused, intelligent hostility that seemed to be directed at him and him alone. After 6 months, they left. They went public with their story, invited investigators in, and the Sallie House became ground zero for serious paranormal research. The house is named after a little girl, Sallie, who, according to local legend, died there in the late 1800s after a botched emergency surgery. Some researchers believe her spirit is present, and that she's generally not malevolent. But the darker theory, the one that most investigators who've spent serious time in that house tend to hold, is that Sallie is just the face of something else. Something that uses the image of a child as a kind of lure, a mask. When Renee Coldwell and her team from the Midwest Anomaly Research Group arrived on a Thursday evening in late September, they had done their homework. Renee had read every published account of the house she could find. She'd spoken with 2 former investigators who had experienced physical manifestations there. She had protocols in place. She had a strict no-provocation policy for her team, and she had specifically selected this group because they were disciplined, experienced, and not given to recklessness. What she hadn't accounted for was the house itself having a way of getting under your skin. The first 2 hours were quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. EMF readings were flat across the entire lower floor. No temperature anomalies, no audio hits, no visual activity. Renee noted in her log that the house felt heavy, her word, like the air had a density to it that regular air didn't. 2 of her team members independently described a feeling of being watched without being able to point to where the sensation was coming from. The activity started at approximately 11:30 p.m. in the upstairs bedroom, the room most associated with the physical attacks on Tony Pickman years before. Renee's colleague, a researcher named David Park, was running a solo session in that room with a K2 meter and a digital voice recorder. The K2, which measures fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, had been sitting completely still for 40 minutes when it suddenly lit up through all 5 of its LED indicators. Full red. Maximum field strength. David calmly began asking questions. "Is there someone here with me right now?" The lights flared again. "Yes." "Can you tell me your name?" What came through on the recorder, recovered during evidence review, was not words through a spirit box. It was a direct EVP, a sound recorded on the device with no audible source in the room. And what the audio captured was a child's voice, soft and slightly distorted, that said a single word. The team's sound analyst later said the voice had a quality he'd never encountered in 12 years of audio work. It was pitched correctly for a child. The cadence was correct. But underneath it, beneath the frequency range of normal speech, there was a secondary sound, low, resonant, and rhythmic, almost like something breathing, something large. 2 sounds layered together, a child on top, something else underneath. David didn't hear it in the room, but he felt the atmosphere change the moment the K2 lit up. He described it later as a pressure shift, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air seems to compress. And then the smell hit him, a sudden sharp smell of something burning, gone as fast as it came. He called Renee up. She came in with a thermal camera, and that's when the visual evidence started accumulating. In the corner of the room, the northeast corner, where Tony Pickman had reported feeling the strongest sense of presence, the thermal feed showed a cold spot. Not anomalous on its own. Cold spots happen, but this one had a shape, a vague, compressed shape, roughly 4 feet tall, that was holding its position in the corner and radiating cold outward like a stone dropped in still water, in rings. Renee aimed the camera directly at it. The shape moved, not away from the camera, toward it, slowly, with that same deliberate quality that Marcus Webb had encountered at the Stanley Hotel. Not the random drift of an air current, but the measured movement of something making a choice. It stopped about 6 feet from Renee, and then, for the first time in the investigation, Renee broke her own protocol. She said very quietly, "Sallie, we know you're here. You don't have to hide." Later, she would say she didn't know why she said it. It wasn't provocation, exactly. It felt more like an invitation, an attempt at connection. But in a house like the Sallie House, the line between an invitation and a provocation is thinner than you'd think. The cold mass on the thermal screen lurched forward. Renee stumbled back, knocked into the doorframe, and in the chaos of the next few seconds, David shouting her name, equipment clattering, thermal camera swinging, the shape dissipated. The temperature in the room surged back up. The K2 flatlined. Silence. Then Renee looked down at her left forearm. 3 marks, parallel, running diagonal across the skin, raised and red, as if something had drawn 3 fingers across her arm under significant pressure. She hadn't felt it. Not in the moment. Not even a sting or a sting of warmth. They had simply appeared between 1 second and the next, in the confusion and noise of whatever had just happened. The team documented the scratches immediately. Photos, timestamps, the whole record. Renee confirmed on camera that her forearm had been clean when they entered the house. No jewelry on that wrist. She had not bumped it against anything sharp. The investigation effectively ended there. Renee made the call. You hit a wall like that, you respect it. They packed up, did a full sweep to make sure they weren't leaving anyone behind. In this business, you do that literally, not just figuratively. And they left. The audio evidence took another week to fully process. When the sound analyst finally completed his review and handed Renee his written notes, the last line read, "I've reviewed and authenticated hundreds of EVP recordings in my career. I don't know what this is, but my professional recommendation is that you do not broadcast it publicly. Not because it lacks validity, because I think some things don't need more attention than they already have." Renee took his advice. She has never released that specific audio file. The Sallie House remains active to this day. Investigators still visit, still conduct sessions, still come away with evidence they can't explain. The owners have been remarkably open about allowing access to researchers, which speaks either to their bravery or their acceptance that what's in that house is simply part of what the house is. Renee Coldwell went back 6 months later. She told her team before they went in, "No invitations this time, no names. We observe, we record, we leave." The scratches on her forearm had faded, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. She said they had left a ghost of a mark in her skin. 3 pale, thin lines barely visible in the right light. A reminder. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. And some houses know exactly what you are the moment you walk through them. The photograph was taken at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. Nobody staged it, nobody edited it. It was pulled directly from an SD card that had been sealed in an evidence bag from the moment it left the camera. Photographed at the moment of sealing and reviewed in the presence of 3 witnesses, including a retired forensic photographer who had spent 22 years with the New York State Police. The image shows a hospital corridor, long, pale institutional walls, old tile floors, a row of doors on the left side, most of them open. And in the corridor, about 30 feet from the camera, standing in the center of the hallway, is a figure. Tall, still, dressed in what looks like patient clothing, a shapeless gown, bare legs. The figure is facing the camera directly, head up, arms at its sides. The forensic photographer looked at that image for a long time. Then he looked at the investigator who had taken it, a woman named Joanna Ferris, who had been doing this work for 9 years and was not prone to drama. "Where is this hallway?" he asked. Joanna Ferris took a breath. "Ward C," she said. "Rolling Hills Asylum." The forensic photographer set the photograph down. "Ward C doesn't exist anymore," he said quietly. Joanna nodded. "I know," she said. "I was standing in it when I took the picture." Rolling Hills Asylum in East Bethany, New York, was built in 1827. Let that age sink in for a moment. 1827. That means this building was standing before the Civil War, before the telephone, before most of the country as we know it existed. It was originally constructed as a county poorhouse, a place where society deposited the people it didn't know what to do with. The poor, the sick, the mentally ill, the elderly, orphaned children. People deemed feeble-minded by the standards of the time, which often meant nothing more sinister than being deaf, or foreign-born, or simply too old to work. Over nearly 2 centuries of operation under various names and purposes, more than 1,700 people died within those walls. Many of them were buried in unmarked graves on the property. Many of them had no family, no record, no one to remember their name. They came to Rolling Hills with nothing, and they were absorbed into the building like moisture into old stone. Gone from the world, but, some believe, not entirely gone from here. The asylum officially closed its doors in 1974. It sat empty for decades before eventually being opened for paranormal investigation and public tours. A decision that has provided an extraordinary volume of documented evidence suggesting that Rolling Hills is among the most genuinely active locations in the country. Joanna Ferris had been here before. This was her 4th visit. She knew the building's layout, she knew its history, and she knew which areas consistently produced the strongest activity. Ward C, the former psychiatric ward on the 2nd floor, had been partially collapsed in a section of the building where the roof had failed. Most of it was still structurally intact, but the county had declared it off-limits pending repairs that had never quite materialized. Joanna had obtained a special research access waiver from the building's owners, which granted her team access to the entire structure, including the restricted sections. She was the only one who went into Ward C that night. Her team, 4 researchers, stayed in the main building conducting their own investigations in the areas they'd worked before. Joanna, with her camera, her audio recorder, her EMF meter, and a flashlight, went into Ward C alone. This was not recklessness. Joanna worked alone in restricted spaces regularly. She was methodical. She stayed in communication with her team via radio, and she never went somewhere she couldn't get out of quickly if she needed to. She went into Ward C alone because, in her experience, Ward C responded more readily to solo presence than to groups. Something about the number of people seemed to suppress activity. Too much noise, too many variables, too much energy that wasn't its own. The ward corridor stretched about 120 feet. Doors on one side, high windows on the other, most of them boarded or broken. The ceiling at the far end had partially come down, exposing wooden beams and insulation that hung in gray strips like something peeled back. The floor was thick with dust, plaster debris, and the occasional scatter of old documents, intake forms, medical records, administrative paperwork that had been left when the building emptied and had spent 50 years slowly disintegrating on the floor. Joanna started her sweep at the near end of the corridor, moving slowly, letting the space settle around her. The EMF meter was quiet. The air was cold. Ward C held cold the way old hospitals always do. A deep institutional chill that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than from any external temperature. At the 20-minute mark, she heard something. Not a bang, not a crash, not the dramatic sounds that get all the attention on television. Just footsteps. Quiet, slow. The sound of something moving across old tile, maybe 50 feet ahead of her. She stopped, aimed her flashlight down the corridor. Nothing. She waited 30 seconds. Then she heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a sound she initially couldn't place. It took her almost a full minute of listening to identify it. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate, slightly labored breathing, coming from inside one of the rooms to her left, third door from where she was standing. Joanna Ferris has a protocol for moments like this that she's refined over 9 years of fieldwork. She doesn't rush toward the sound. She doesn't announce herself immediately. She first confirms that the sound is not her own body, not her equipment, not an ambient acoustic effect of the building. She controls her breathing, holds her equipment still, eliminates every variable she can. The breathing continued, steady, coming from behind that door. She crossed to it. The door was ajar, hanging slightly open, the hinges rusted but functional. She pushed it gently with one finger. The room beyond was a former patient room. Single iron bed frame bolted to the floor, the mattress long gone, a metal cabinet standing open and empty against the far wall. A single window, boarded from the outside, with thin lines of blue-gray November light squeezing through the gaps. The room was empty, but the breathing was louder now. Definitely in this room. Definitely not her own. Joanna set up her audio recorder on the bed frame, turned on her full-spectrum camera, which captures light outside the visible spectrum, useful for detecting presences that don't show up in standard photography. And she began talking. Not questions, just talking. She introduced herself. She said why she was there. She mentioned the names of some of the former patients she'd researched. Roy, a man who'd spent 40 years in Ward C after being committed for epilepsy. Margaret, a woman who'd lost her children during the Depression and been declared mentally unfit for grief. Arthur, a teenager brought in at 17 and never released. When she said Arthur's name, the breathing stopped. Just stopped. Mid-breath, mid-exhale, cut off like a switch thrown. Then the EMF meter, which had been at baseline for 22 minutes, spiked. And then the light above the door, a battery-powered LED work light she'd placed there when she entered the corridor, turned off. Complete darkness. Joanna switched to her camera's night vision, held her position, kept talking. Arthur? It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to know you're here. Her voice, captured on the audio recorder, is completely steady. Not a tremor in it. 9 years does that to you. She aimed the camera down the corridor and took a burst of photographs. That is the origin of the image described in the hook. The figure in the corridor, standing 30 feet away, facing the camera, bare-legged in institutional clothing, arms at its sides. The full-spectrum camera captures a wider range of light than the human eye can process, which is why Joanna saw nothing when she looked down the corridor herself. But the camera saw it. Clear, defined, present. A person who should not have been there. She called it into her team. Standard protocol. Confirm head count. Make sure no one had entered the building unannounced. All 4 team members were confirmed in their locations. The building had been locked when they arrived, and they had the only keys. When the work light came back on, 7 minutes after it went out, with no intervention, the battery fully charged when she checked it, the corridor was empty. But the audio recorder caught something in those 7 minutes. Clear, direct, unambiguous. A voice, male, quiet, with the flattened vowels and cadence of old upstate New York. The voice said, "I didn't want to stay." And then, after a long pause, nobody asked. 4 words and a pause, and in those 4 words you can hear the weight of an entire life. A kid brought into a building at 17. 50 years of being nobody's priority. Not discharged, not forgotten exactly. Just never enough of a priority to act on. Until the building closed and everybody just left. And the building held him. The way buildings like this hold everything they absorb. Every year, every name, every person who slept in those iron beds and looked at those plaster walls and waited for something that never came. Joanna Ferris sat in that room for another hour. She talked to Arthur, if it was Arthur, or whoever it was that breathed in the dark of Ward C. And at the end she said something she says at every investigation she conducts. She says it to every space, every presence, every piece of evidence she collects. She said, "You are not forgotten. Your name is known. You were here, and you mattered." The EMF meter pulsed once, a single brief spike. And then the corridor was just an old corridor. Cold tile and hanging plaster and 50-year-old paperwork decaying on the floor. Joanna packed her equipment, did her full check, and walked out of Ward C. The forensic photographer who reviewed the photograph submitted a 3-page written report to the research organization that sponsored the investigation. His conclusion, in the final paragraph, read as follows: "I can find no evidence of manipulation, staging, projection, double exposure, or post-capture alteration in this photograph. The figure present in the image does not correspond to any member of the documented research team. I am unable to account for its presence. I make no claim as to what it represents. I report only what I can and cannot verify." Rolling Hills Asylum is still there, in East Bethany, New York. Still standing after nearly 200 years. Still holding what it holds. Ward C is still restricted. And somewhere in the dust of that long corridor, in the cold blue light leaking through the boarded windows, there are 1,700 names. Most of them unspoken for decades. Most of them unknown to the world. But not to Joanna Ferris. She keeps a list. She always says their names.